Degrowth is about life and death, not only for us in this generation, but for our future generations. If you care about justice, if you care about economic growth, if you're someone living in a rural community, in the urban environment, you should care about degrowth and look at it critically and contribute to it and try not to bastardize it as a political tool.
Welcome to another episode of Impact on the Intersection podcast, brought to you by the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business. I'm Dori Pap, Managing Director of the Institute for Leadership and Social Impact, an interdisciplinary initiative dedicated to fostering servant leadership and organizational practices that contribute to a more just, caring, and sustainable world. In today's episode, we'll explore a thought-provoking question: has the economy outgrown the planet? To help us unpack this complex issue, we're joined by two distinguished guests, Dr. John Mulrow and Dr. Joe Bozeman. John is a degrowth researcher and activist based in Chicago, Illinois. He's a co-founder of Degrowth US, director of the Degrowth Institute, and an adjunct assistant professor of environmental and ecological engineering at Purdue University. A former postdoctoral fellow in civil and environmental engineering at Georgia Tech, John was honored with the Georgia Humanitarian Service Award for his contributions to the state's COVID-19 response. Joe is an assistant professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Georgia Tech. His research journey began in sustainable energy development before shifting toward climate change adaptation and mitigation. His work now focuses on developing equitable solutions for challenges in urban carbon management, socio-ecological systems, and the food-energy-water nexus. Beyond their impressive credentials, John and Joe share a long-standing professional connection, having both completed their doctoral work at the University of Illinois in Chicago and later collaborating at Georgia Tech during John's postdoc appointment. Today, they come together to discuss degrowth, a topic that remains relatively new in scholarly circles, but is becoming increasingly relevant as we confront our planet's ecological limits. To introduce the term, let's look at the definition provided by the Degrowth Institute, which John directs. Degrowth is an intentional downscaling of the global economy, a necessary step for achieving ecological and social justice goals. Before we dive into the details of this definition, it's my pleasure to welcome John and Joe to the podcast today. Welcome.
Thanks, Dori.
Thank you.
Good to be here with you, Joe.
Yes.
Reunited at last.
John and Joe, welcome. I'd like to start by asking both of you, maybe John and then Joe, what led you to this work, both professionally and personally?
To degrowth. In short, what led me to degrowth was just a long-standing suspicion that the hard work I was doing on environmental sustainability, reducing waste, transitioning our energy system, that a lot of those savings weren't going where we think they go in a common sense kind of way. Mm-hmm. You know, you use your reusable water bottle instead of a plastic water bottle, and you claim, I've just reduced one water bottle. Mm-hmm. That's a common metric that we hear. But when I got out of college and into the working world and started diving in dumpsters professionally to do waste assessments for companies, I found that the money saved not buying that plastic water bottle was buying some other type of material, probably made out of plastic. So this growing suspicion led me to my PhD, led me to meeting Joe, working with Joe on material flow assessment, environmental impact assessment. Long story short, every assessment comes back to this question, which I'm going to repeat many times: what happens to the savings? And the answer with many of our environmental works is that the savings goes into economic growth. And so ultimately, if we want to reduce environmental impacts, we will have a confrontation with growth at a global scale. So the Degrowth Institute is just putting that message right out there into the world sooner than later, and saying that, yes, the economy has outgrown the planet, and it's time for us to pair the hard work that's been done in environmental sustainability and social justice with a limit, an intentional limit on the size of the economy. Yeah. And so we're promoting that message right there. Yeah. That pairing, that teamwork.
And how I got here has some overlaps with John's story, obviously. You know, we certainly have some professional linkages, even some personal ones. But I actually started out being an advocate for equity and justice work. I come from humble beginnings. A lot of my family members do, even my extended family in
Ohio.
In Dayton, Ohio. I also married into a South African family also. And what's really central to those lived experiences, at least the ones I had, are racial tensions, economic tensions. So economic justice and environmental justice were two concepts that, before I even knew what the terms were, they were really important to me. And as I navigated through college, eventually running into John and starting to work on the life cycle assessment material flow analysis work, it became really apparent that we have to actually stop using and consuming at the same levels, and also have global signals to encourage us to stop doing those things if we really want to get to a place of having social justice, social equity, and maybe even just as important, economic justice. And it was pretty obvious. I worked in the public sector doing a lot of dumpster diving and environmental compliance work, and a lot of my efforts, I find efficiencies here, find efficiencies there, and then that money gets redistributed to create more consumption and more growth. So I'm on a treadmill that's never ending, so to speak. And if we really want to challenge some of these issues and then have a healthier life for all of us moving forward, we're going to have to dig into degrowth, understand its strengths, understand some of its myths, and figure out how to move forward.
Thank you for that. And both of you already alluded to it. So let's go deep. Let's talk about some of the myths to infinite growth. There are many, and the Degrowth Institute has a list of 6 key challenges to growth. And I would love to hear what are the ones that you believe are most urgent for us as a society to understand. Is it the myth of GDP? Is it sustainable growth? What is top of mind for each of you?
Well, being with Joe is always comfort zone for me because we both have degrees in engineering. You got an undergrad degree in engineering.
That's right.
My undergrad degree is environmental science. But we find ourselves talking about how society works, but we expect engineers to only comment on how machines and materials work. But I do like to, my number one point for the Degrowth Institute is that all economic activity is material and ecological in some way. So you can't get a latte without requiring the paper from trees, the plants to be grown, the heat and energy required to make the latte. But you also can't have a creative thought without having eaten some food somewhere along the line. So every bit of activity is environmentally impactful in some way. So that's point number one, because there is no creating a zero impact economy. That term, or when we hear things like the word zero waste, I worked in the world of zero waste for a long time. And I just started having beef with that term at some point because it felt like a misnomer in what economic activity is. It fundamentally requires resources. And so in that sense, there will be a limit. Now, we can make the economy more efficient. You can get more value, more personal value out of less inputs, but you have to recognize that material fact right off the bat, paired with the finite ecological system we clearly live on. So that's point number one. And I'd like to hear what you got from there, Joe.
And I'm not sure if it's on the list of top 6, but I know for me, one of the myths is that degrowth automatically means economic ruin. That's not really what we're messaging here. We're saying that there needs to be limits to growth and balance with natural resources and balance of justice issues and the like, which may mean that we value the social component. If you think of sustainability as being 3 components, social, environmental, and policy, you have to balance that social element also. So to me, I think the myth around degrowth messaging, if you've ever heard of this before, it's possible that you've heard it wrapped in a bow of economic ruin. The myth around that is, no, you can have economic success. It will be a different kind of economic success. But if we adopt degrowth, that success will be widespread and actually sustainable rather than the version we have today.
Yeah, and I think part of that myth is that GDP growth or having more or producing more equals well-being, both societal, ecological, and personal well-being. So I'll pass it back to you. What is the next myth?
Yeah, well, we can just stay on the first myth.
Okay.
I think we could stay out there forever. We need to talk about global society, which is kind of number two. But that question of how we evaluate progress is important, but it brings us back to GDP. And GDP is a metric of economic productivity, so it measures all of the goods and services delivered by an economy to people or governments.
Gross domestic product, just for clarity.
Yes, thank you. GDP, gross domestic product, or GWP, gross world product, which would be the whole planetary scale. And GDP tracks really well over time with some key global ecological metrics like CO2, and that relates to that kind of fundamental ecological input requirement that GDP has.
This
so
triggers
important.
something for me, actually, because one of my first reports when I started my PhD was on a speech Bobby Kennedy did, and he talked about GDP and its strengths, but also its weaknesses. Now, I don't think he used the term degrowth specifically, but I would say another myth that should be in the top 6 if it's not there is that this is somehow a completely new concept. It's not.
Yeah.
This is something that politicians of all stripes, folks from all walks of life over time have been exploring for a great deal of time. And I think it's pretty clear, given extreme weather events, the increasing frequency of them, climate change itself, and quite frankly, the instability politically around the world, that we really need to adopt a stabilizing concept of ground truths around degrowth worldwide to be able to really figure out how to move the planet in the right direction long term. So if you care about this kind of thing, try not to fall into the political silos and approach this with sober eyes, with a non-political lens, I would say.
It's tough, like mind explosion right now of potential responses. Like I'm already, you know how this goes. You're like, I'm already lining up the responses to that because, I mean, there's a lot of good data that GDP is really well correlated with environmental impact, but it's also really well correlated with things like child survival rates and health metrics of a certain kind.
Depending on which indicator you use.
It's correlated with calories available. And so there's a lot of well-being metrics that do correlate with GDP, but there's a lot that don't. So because it's so correlated with undermining our global ecology, then you have to ask yourself, now we're doing a different equation where we're saying, whoa, there is a limit to maintaining the livable planet, which is fundamental to well-being. Yeah. So how much are we willing to mitigate those metrics along with the positive ones that it is? And for that, you just need, I think the Bobby Kennedy quote was, we need alternative metrics.
Yes. And you said the phrase global ecology too, which it just really hits home for me because there are some cultures that think of the planet Earth itself almost as a deity within itself. And practically speaking, we need this as a human species to survive. Why not actually pay attention to helping it survive for us? I mean, it will last beyond our human species if something catastrophic happened, of course. But when it comes down to it, if we want to survive in a balanced and healthy way, we have to figure out how to be in symbiosis with it, which brings us to this whole scientific term that almost no one understands the meaning of, which is industrial ecology or industrial symbiosis, which is the genesis of where we at least connected. So look into that if you have some time, y'all. But nonetheless, how do we depoliticize the concept at the human level, but also how do we lift up the planet itself as being a living and breathing thing, almost as if it was sitting by us right now, because we're sitting on it. it won't be here forever if we continue to treat it the way we have. And that's simply put, right?
But then why can't technologies that why can't companies whose success is largely measured by growth, why can't companies solve those problems?
I think they can. That's why we're here.
But then they have to grow as a metric, and there's a big conundrum still of like we're not going to solve it in this conversation, but there's a big question. I think if you say we need an intentional downscaling of the global economy to meet ecological and social justice goals, then you're taking two things that everybody is ostensibly for, ecological sustainability and social justice, but you're adding something that people are not used to being for.
Yeah.
Which is economic downscaling. Yeah. And that's the part that is going to be tough. And we need a lot of different people working on that question.
When you say that phrase, I don't know about you, I don't know about the listeners, I don't know about you, Dori, but I can't help but think of, I'm going to lose my job when you say that.
Yeah.
Right? But that's not really what we're saying. We're saying if we create a new kind of economy where these natural resources are prevalent, you might have a different kind of job. We're already seeing the transition happen anyway with the circular economy, the greening of products, labeling, more regenerative farming, healthier food options in the United States context in particular. Other countries have been ahead of the game in some ways. How do we catalyze that effort while maintaining a quality of life for the vast majority of citizens? Mm-hmm. That's going to be a tough thing to do, a tough transition to make with the degrowth concept, but it's one I think we have to, even if it's a little painful. We just have to do it.
And I think that the degrowth conversation is framed by many as losing something, right? You said, Joe, I think about losing my job. But I think there's a lot of proof and a lot to be imagined about what would my everyday look like if I didn't have to work 5 days a week or 80 hours a week or even more. What would my quality of life, my family life, my mental health, my well-being overall look like if the framing wasn't incessant and continuous growth? So what would your lives look like?
Well, I think that we first need more people to realize that the growth need requirement, the growth paradigm, or the requirement that the economy constantly grow is the reason that when you get a appliance that saves you some time or an automated assistant that helps you schedule, because everybody gets that, and we're all competing to grow, you end up never using that saved time to rest. You use it to work more.
Exactly.
And so, but what I'm saying is, I think what's fueling the degrowth movement, in my observation, is more and more sustainability professionals, especially like myself, working their butt off to save resources and realizing that those resources are not conserved. There's no coherent system for ensuring that fossil fuels not used because you replaced your light bulbs are not demanded. They are not. We, in fact, have a global economic system that very efficiently reallocates those energy resources somewhere else in the world that wants them. And because we live in such an inequitable global system, there's always a huge tail of folks who rightfully so demand those resources. So until we constantly have that global context in every single one of our sustainability conversations, I don't even really trust people to come up with good visions of their lifestyle in the future, because we just haven't put that global context in. I promised I'd stay in the global context point, which I think is like it's very important. It's fundamental before you dive into all the policy proposals and the visions of what the future looks like.
Yeah, it's like making this room super efficient that we're in now. But throwing all of our trash outside the space and acting like it doesn't exist. Although when the cameras shut off and these microphones shut down, we're stepping on the trash. And that's essentially what we're saying is we don't have space to ignore it anymore.
Yeah, we definitely don't.
We don't have space to ignore it anymore. The implications are real right now. We have kids. I want them to have some hope and optimism and clean air and clean water. I know you've heard these things before, but my hope is, given what we've been experiencing as a species, especially here in the United States, that we can hear these phrases with new ears now, with new life, with new meaning, hopefully with more clear eyes.
And there's a lot of the degrowth conversation is like I mentioned, growing in the sustainability space, or the limits to growth conversation, the post-growth conversation, the need to move beyond the need to grow. But as we've talked about, there's a lot of folks who are already very articulate on that without using the term degrowth, because there's an entire global population that's used to being promised automation or well-being or more protections. But most of the gains go to a small subset of society. There's a degrowth writer who runs the blog Degrowth is the Answer, who recently showed the numbers for the U.S. that showed something like 80% of the value of economic growth over the last 20 years has gone to 10% of the population. So if you take the totality of economic growth, most of that went to the foam at the top of the latte or whatever.
There you go.
It went to a small subset of society. And that in itself is a critique of growth.
Yeah, and that's something that is not new, right? That trickle down doesn't work. It didn't start
So we're saying, I think sustainability folks are catching up on that language, which is really important. And that's what the Institute is doing, is bringing in voices that have been saying this for a long time, joining them with the sustainability conversation that's turning a corner on how we tackle things like climate change, and saying the global economy is involved, and now creating this language that's using degrowth as the banner term.
I mean, what are the animal representations for our political Republican and Democrat? It's like an elephant and a
donkey.
And a donkey. I mean, I get the elephant in the room, so to speak, is really the hyper-politicized nature of everything from climate change. And right now, I don't think degrowth is a focal piece right now, but...
Yeah, we're pretty far off the radar.
But still, how do we address climate change and sustainability without falling into a hyper-politicized world? And I don't know if we can, so we're going to have to figure out how to operate in it. So my hope is, for those that are listening, you can use this podcast, you can use some of the other materials that you look into, and realize you're not choosing political sides when you're exploring this. You are choosing life over death. I hate to put it so plainly, but that's what it comes down to, if we need to put it simply. And my hope is, as the degrowth concept takes stronger hold in the United States, folks can think of it in those terms rather than political ones, which these days everything seems to be politicized. I'm hoping we can have a healthy conversation that's about life and death, ecological safety, rather than Republican or Democrat in the U.S. context.
Well, I was at a degrowth kind of colloquium at Purdue that we used to run once a month, and the conversation came up like, okay, let's say we need to degrow. How do we organize it? Why should the U.S. go first if other countries aren't committed? And then we're in this classic kind of conversation that's already been had in global climate change, which is who moves first, who's responsible now, who's responsible historically. But I really liked the exercise that was prompted because we were talking about how the U.S. does degrowth. And someone was like, well, let's all look at the tags on our clothes. Like, Joe, where's this shirt made?
Oh, let's see. Made in Indonesia.
Yeah. So there was very few. I think there was one person that had a tag that said made in the USA. And that right there was just that's all the evidence you need. We live in a global society. We live in a global economy. we have to work together, you're kind of kidding yourself if you want to divide up ecologically or economically the world into political boundaries. We're just so well connected. And, you know, I now use that clothing tag example all the time when the global politics conversation comes up.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that in. So clearly the length of a podcast is not nearly enough to cover all the aspects of this important topic. So I want to ask you both, what is the invitation that you want to leave our audience with?
Maybe I can start with this one. You can close it out. For me, and you've heard me say this again, but I'll say it again because repetition works. Degrowth is about life and death, not only for us in this generation, but for our future generations. If you have kids, if you just like kids, this is something that you want to consider exploring. This is something that you can also be critical of, right? Because being critical of this is the way that it grows and evolves into something that the U.S. can take hold of long term. So my final message would be, if you care about justice, if you care about economic growth, if you're someone living in a rural community, in the urban environment, you should care about degrowth and look at it critically and contribute to it and try not to bastardize it as a political tool.
Thanks, Joe.
You're not going to, I can't beat the kids, the call to kids.
The survival of our kids.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the deep down searching that you have to do. So I'll just do the complete opposite side of that, which is like, what's the most immediate thing you can do? And this is something that I address for sustainability professionals all the time. Business school students could take this to heart, definitely. And that is, ask the question, what happens to the savings? So if you do a project that's promising to reduce energy use or introduce a more efficient process, what does not just the company do with the savings? That'd be a great step one, ask what the company does with the savings. But if you can't track that, just thought experiment. What do you think the global economy does with the savings? You know, when it comes to fossil fuels, it's pretty easy to think that one out. There's a global market for petroleum. So those unsold gallons go somewhere else on planet Earth.
The Jevon paradox.
And yeah, that's the one way to term that is the rebound effect, unintended consequences, or the Jevons paradox. If you want to look up that term, or we could put that in the notes. But I always sum up the action item as ask what happens to the savings. You don't have to answer it directly. Just think it out a little bit. And if you ask that question enough times, you will find that we have to talk about the global economy alongside every sustainability and social justice conversation, for that matter.
Period.
John and Joe, thank you both for sharing your insights and perspective with us. And to our listeners, we appreciate you tuning in. Hopefully this conversation has sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to explore the topic of degrowth further. If you're interested in diving deeper, there are many ways to engage in the broader conversation on degrowth. We'll include links to key resources, some that you heard mentioned, along with everything we referenced in today's discussion in the show notes. Stay curious and keep questioning.